Hi everyone, so we're moving into the internal area now, Chapter 11, Internal Resources, Capabilities and Competences. So far, we've really sort of emphasized the need for businesses to look at the external environment and to interact with the internal environment. In this particular chapter, we're going to focus on the flip side of that. Let me show you what I mean. First area here is when we talk about strategic capability, I guess the sort of emphasis in this chapter is if we're thinking about the internal workings of an organization, we're really thinking about the resources that it has. And this particular approach is really another approach, if you will, to strategy formulation. In other words, this is a way in which businesses, if they leave aside, let's say, the ACCA model or the three-part model, analysis, choice and implementation, and indeed the other models associated with forming strategy, the emergent approach, etc. They could consider this approach. So what's the logic behind it? Well, the logic behind a resource-based approach to strategy is to suggest that really, in terms of capability, or an organization's capability drives two key things. It drives the performance of the organization, in other words, the results, and indeed the competitive advantage. So rather than simply saying, well, we need to look outward, we need to look externally, we need to use PEST, Porter's Five Forces, Porter's Diamond, etc., etc. Let's start the process by looking internally. What are we good at? You know, a good example of this really would be a company like Apple and indeed the launch of the iPhone. You know, Apple had been around for many, many years, I think since the 1970s. And what they did is they turned their expertise and indeed, I guess, their capabilities into a completely new industry. So in essence, the starting point here is, well, what we're good at should drive strategy, not what's happening in the internal environment. Let's wrap our capabilities, around our future. Outside of that, when we think of internal versus sort of external analysis, are we suggesting with the resource-based approach to strategy formulation or devising strategies just based on what we've got? Are we saying that external analysis is irrelevant? No, we're not. We're saying that possibly a combination. But in this particular approach, I guess what comes first is to say, okay, let's look at ourselves. Let's look at some tools and techniques, perhaps a resource audit, strengths and weaknesses, Porter's value chain, etc. Let's analyze ourselves internally first, and then let's look externally. So there's this sort of a starting point, if you will. Let's define a few terms here. Now, this is important for your success in the SBL exam. These are some key definitions. Let's look at resources first. What do we mean? We're talking about broadly, assets. Yeah, and I don't mean that necessarily in just the financial sort of viewpoint, because human assets, certainly we don't capitalize people or capitalize their skills. We're talking about really everything, physical assets, intangible assets, and also, people as well. Those are our resources. And note, we'd include in there, funds, cash, money, etc. In terms of the next key area, competences, well, really, the firm's ability to utilize its resources effectively. Let's put that in another way. Well, competences really is, what you are good at, because what you are good at will enable, proper and indeed effective and efficient use of your resources. If you don't have a lot of skills or abilities or capabilities, but you have a lot of resources, you're not really in a great position. Outside of that, let's look back now at strategic capabilities. We said up top that capabilities are really what drives performance, i.e. results, and indeed, competitive advantage. In effect, your edge over your competitors. So what do we mean by capabilities? Sorry, let me just go back one second. Really what we're talking about is the combo. So the combination of all those assets, whether or not it's physical, intangible, human, etc., and indeed your abilities, really, to create competitive advantage. And that's what businesses, particularly for-profit businesses, are all about, an edge over your competitors. Now let's break that down even further. Now this is an important area. So let's talk about threshold capabilities. Now here, really, we're saying this is the minimum level to be able to compete in a particular market and indeed to achieve parity. So without these basic, if you will, or threshold capabilities, you can't even compete. There is no point in being in this market. Outside of that, distinctive capabilities. So this is what gives competitive advantage. So this might be in relation to a resource or a core competence. Note that we're talking about unique resources, resources that are unique to you, whatever they are, whatever type of asset that it is. Or, note the term, a core competence, something that really only you can do really, really well. You know, a good example, certainly in the early days of the cell phone, smartphone industry, would be Apple. And the quality and the functionality of the phones that they were producing. Now, obviously, the competition has caught up. A variety of different companies, not least Samsung, but also others. So note the difference between the two, and note these words: threshold versus distinctive capabilities. Let's get savvy with these terms. Next key point is, a position audit or position analysis. So let's think about this. If we're to look at ourselves internally, then I guess we need some tools, don't we, to be able to analyze ourselves internally. In a sense, what we're sort of doing is we're sort of analyzing our position, or we're doing a position audit. This is where we are right now, and looking internally, this is what we have. This means analyzing and assessing resources and competences, whatever they are. What exactly do we have? Because that's going to drive us forward, drive our strategies forward. Next area for us is really this idea of pinpointing resources in particular. What we've talked about so far is broadly strategic capabilities. So let's hone in on our resources. And remember, we said up top, broadly speaking, we're talking about any asset that we use, and not just in the financial sense of the word. So resources are going to be split really two ways, a little bit like capabilities. So again, remember, threshold, just the minimum required to be able to compete in the market, and to use the term above, to achieve parity, sort of equality or equalness with the basic players or the many players, the many competitors. So there's threshold. What about unique? Now, unique is all about competitive advantage. And what we really want when we think about unique resources are things that other companies certainly don't have now, or it's very, very difficult for them to obtain or imitate. Again, going back to the phone market, cell phone market, Apple's a good example. You could also bring in perhaps the German car industry as well, and some of the unique, certainly leading brands. Very, very difficult for new players to arrive and to usurp, for example, companies like Mercedes or indeed Porsche, etc. Not impossible. There are some new players who have been around in the car industry, car manufacturing for 20, 30 years, but difficult to do, okay, and takes time. In terms of this next area, here's an approach or maybe a technique that a company could use to sort of establish what their resources are, and it's called the 5M approach. And pretty straightforward, really. What we'd be looking to do as the user is just to consider each of these areas. So let's think about our manpower, for example. What do we have in terms of expertise, or indeed management, or perhaps industrial relations, or in terms of the structure of our organization? How are we organized? And, what do we have, resource-wise, stroke asset-wise, that other companies do not have in a manpower sense? Second M, money, probably an obvious one here when we think about resources. Cash is king. We need money, but what do we have? What do we have in terms of future profitability? What's our cash flow like? What about getting access to cash? What's our credit rating like? And indeed, what's our relationship and image with, let's say, shareholders and financiers? Because if we need more financial backing, that's where we're going. Linked into that, given our relationship or image with shareholders, what is the available funding? Is funding available or is it not? Because if it's not available, that's a problem. Next area of the M's is machinery. Okay. Again, perhaps if we're a manufacturing company, we'd be looking at operational capacity. Are we at full pelt right now? Do we need more machinery? How do we control quality? And in terms of the equipment and indeed machinery that we use, is it up to date in a technological sense? Certainly, tech has become more and more relevant to all businesses, not just manufacturing business, in the last 10 to 20 years. Linked into that, what are we spending on R&D? Are we spending anything? Can we afford to? What would be involved? Linked into that, we could be a business that is a manufacturing business, but perhaps there are areas of the business that we currently pursue in-house. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should outsource. What about our systems in terms of our internal systems, stock holding, warehousing, etc.? Is a technique such as just in time, is that relevant? Would it suit our type of business? Next area is materials. So specifically what we're talking about there is the obvious, and I'll deal with inventory in a moment, but also, we obtain materials, don't we, from suppliers. Now, how good are they? Is the material high quality? Is it only available from a certain number of suppliers? Or is it the type of material that is available or readily available from many, many different suppliers? Linked into that inventory, now we mentioned up top JIT, there are many, many systems and routes and approaches to managing inventory. What about our levels? What about the logistics in terms of receiving materials? And indeed outside of that, what about these areas, emissions, waste, etc., etc.? Last area of the M's is markets. So what is our market? Who are our customers, and what is it that we actually produce? Let's understand all aspects of the market, our position, our share, indeed the image, or indeed the affiliation to our brand, and then over and up above that, linked into materials above, certainly the channels through which we distribute and how we control them along the supply chain. So there's one approach, just one, to looking at the area of resources. The next area is really with regard to the difference, I guess, between the two, intangible versus tangible. Certainly in the modern world, we find that intangible assets are certainly as important as tangible assets. So tangible and intangible assets, make an organization difficult to duplicate. And, if that's the case, then, our ability to sustain competitive advantage, in other words, to keep ahead of the pack, becomes better, stronger, and indeed much more difficult for people to copy. We need, I guess, unique resources. Let's take a look at the type of resources and type of intangible resources that we would be talking about. So this is just an example, and again, we don't need to be rote learning off this sort of information. Let's just have a feel for this area. So when we think of legally protected or intangible assets that could be protected, we're talking about these sorts of things: secrets, licenses, designs, copyrights, etc. Okay. Outside of that, when we think about areas of intangibles that it's more difficult to protect, but certainly that have value. Obviously, things like information that's readily available, or perhaps our reputation, or perhaps our ability to develop networks, our stakeholder management, our personal networks, the relationships perhaps that the board have with other players in the market, with governmental bodies, with regulators, etc., etc. So there's the two sides to sort of assets, as it were. What about key resources or intangible resources or functional skills? Well, many things here, certainly employee and indeed supplier, distributor, servicer know-how. In other words, the innate knowledge that these stakeholders will have. Linked into that, when we think about cultural capabilities, we're thinking about things like the perception, for example, of the quality of our product or indeed our service. Outside of that, our ability, for example, to innovate, perhaps in a new jurisdiction or perhaps overseas, and indeed things such as teamwork or teamwork ability. Okay, so that's the sort of I guess the trade-off between sort of tangibles and indeed intangibles, and some guidance on how important intangibles are for the business and the myriad of intangibles that are available to a business. Let's talk a little bit now about competences. We've talked about resources, and remember up top, when we said competences, we're sort of really talking about the ability of a firm, of a given organization to use assets well. So again, key points here. They're either going to be threshold, in other words, the minimum needed to compete. And indeed, ideally, these competences, are to some extent, easy to copy. They're readily available, and many competitors have these same threshold competencies. Let's talk about something more important, core. Okay, now these buzzwords, as I've said, these definitions are important to us. Let's have a good feel for exactly what we mean. Now, when we think about a core competence, we're saying that the firm can do this well, and this particular thing allows the organization to beat its competitors. This is something different. So again, looking back at let's say the German car industry or even Apple, when we think about the sort of origins of car manufacture or even cell phone manufacture, these companies had something different that they did well. I mean, Apple had the history of making computers from the 1970s onwards. They had core competence, and what they decided to do was to use that core competence that other companies in the market could not imitate in order to sort of usurp the competition. And they certainly did. Certainly in the early years, they beat the competition. But there are some conditions attached. We can't just think to ourselves, oh, we've got loads and loads of core competencies. Well, do you really? Here's a couple of conditions. Yeah. First things first, these core competencies provide serious customer benefits, and the customers are aware of this. Second key point, imitation. They're very difficult to imitate. They're not easy to copy. Third condition, indeed, they can be leveraged widely. So in other words, these competencies can be applied, generally speaking, to perhaps different products, different services, and indeed different markets. So that's the competencies area, linked into an assessment of resources and indeed competencies. Certainly costs are important, and indeed controlling, maintaining costs. Now, I'm not talking about price, remember, I'm talking about cost here. So let's talk a little bit about cost efficiency. This first phrase, and we see this throughout the SBL syllabus, economies of scale. So, for example, when we talk about, the threat of new entrants to the market, or indeed barriers to entry, under the banner of Porter's Five Forces, which is used to assess the attractiveness and profitability of a given market or industry. We talk about economies of scale, don't we? We say that players in the market will have economies of scale, and new players or new entrants, if they want to enter the market, will see that as a disadvantage to them, because new players will not have economies of scale because they're not established. So what do we mean? Well, we mean the ability to reduce costs, in particular fixed costs per unit, with either greater specialization, but generally higher volumes. So, in other words, put simply, the more we produce, the bigger we are, the more we're spreading our fixed costs, and indeed all our costs, over more units. That's an advantage for business, and this is a way to be more efficient cost-wise. In terms of supply costs, really what we're saying here is that supply costs are really anything. I think this is incorrect. Actually, shouldn't be there. But in terms of supply costs, what we're saying is that companies can focus on their supply. They can focus on the relationship they have with suppliers, and indeed sourcing the most efficient or cost-effective methods of obtaining, let's say, raw materials, or obtaining parts or components. Next area for us is sort of product or process design. So, for example, we can design our processes, our product processes, in order to be very, very efficient from a labor perspective. That takes organization, or perhaps from a yield perspective. In other words, the idea that we get more yield from materials, let's say, than other competitors do, if we're smart about it. Okay. Next area for us is experience. So, in other words, we can gain cost advantages by being experienced. And I've referenced the experience curve here. Pretty simple. It suggests simply that the more times that you do things, the better you get, the faster you get, the more efficient you get at doing those things. So the experience curve is certainly relevant to your cost base and being efficient in cost terms. Another area here, first mover. So again, all we're talking about here is where individual entities, organizations are the first on the pitch, then certainly more often than not, that gives them the opportunity to be more efficient because they learn early and learn more quickly about the market. Okay, let's move on from there. Let's talk a little bit about the VRIN model put forward by JSW. Now, bringing this together in terms of what we've been discussing up top, we've talked about resources and indeed competencies, and we've talked about how important it is to differentiate or to have things, abilities, assets, etc., that others don't have. So the VRIN model is right on point here. What Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington basically said, and the reason they developed this VRIN model, is to help an organization assess its overall strategic capabilities, and indeed to determine, given that assessment, whether or not those capabilities can lead to sustainable competitive advantage. This phrase keeps coming up, doesn't it? Sustainable competitive advantage. So I guess, what are they? Well, firstly, their value, the value of strategic capabilities. Secondly, their rarity. Thirdly, their inimitability. And fourthly, their non-substitutability. Okay, let's run through each of these points and see what we mean. Let's talk about value first. Okay, so under the VRIN model, really what we're saying, bear with me, my apologies, what we're saying is let's ask ourselves some questions in relation to the value of these various strategic capabilities that we think we have. So, does the particular capability enable the organization to take advantage of opportunities and neutralize threats? Really, it's a yes or no. Is this capability valued by customers? Let's ask customers. It suggests here, it seems like an obvious requirement, but sometimes we see firms doing things or perhaps developing capabilities they believe are important, but because they haven't consulted with, perhaps surveyed, or because they don't understand their customer well enough, actually the customers don't value them. Linked into that, do the capabilities enable the organization to provide a product or service that competitors cannot provide? We're talking about uniqueness. Final point, does the cost of the capability, enable the organization to make a reasonable level of return? So again, we're talking about cost versus benefit. What are the costs of keeping this capability in play? Are they excessive, and does the possible return outweigh that cost? Next area for us is rarity. Again, this does what it says in the tin. We really can't value a capability if everyone's got it, or if it's not rare. It needs to be rare, a la Apple, etc. In terms of imitability, let's just say that it's not rare, but could competitors imitate it? We need to be in a position that competitors would find it very, very hard to imitate this particular capability. Final point is substitutability, non-substitutability even. So what do we mean by that? Well, similar to the above, we're really saying that, product or, service substitution is where really our product or indeed our service is easily usurped or possibly replaced by some form of substitute. In other words, it may well not be a competitor product, but it's something that meets the same need of customers. So a simple example would be perhaps a cell phone versus a landline phone. Typically they could be used sort of in the same way, but they're not quite competitors. But in one sense, they do satisfy the consumer's need to make a phone call. So to what degree is our product or could our service be substituted in some way? Next one is, competence substitution is where alternative competencies are developed. So, for example, the mechanism, let's say, of tasks that were previously manual in some way or performed by skilled workers. So there's a problem there. Is that something that could happen in relation to our competence? Okay. Let's move on to the next area here in terms of really knowledge and indeed types of knowledge. An important area for us and indeed for all businesses now. So broadly speaking, when we think about knowledge and indeed knowledge management, there's sort of three main types of knowledge. So organizational wide knowledge, really something that is accumulated within systems, within systems or routines or activities, and it's really shared across the organization. So you might look at that as the firm's total, indeed collective knowledge housed within the firm. Very broad. Next area for us is explicit knowledge. So here we're talking about sort of codified or indeed objective knowledge, transmitted in formal systematic ways. It may well be, for example, in a systems manual. It could be something else. The last area for us is tacit knowledge. Really, we're talking about the sort of perhaps personal knowledge or content specific or function specific knowledge, that is quite hard to formalize and communicate. So down to perhaps skills and know-how and expertise in different departments held by different people. So several different types of knowledge within an organization. What do we mean by managing knowledge or indeed knowledge management? Okay. First key point is really the sort of, we're really talking about an integrated approach. In other words, an approach which sort of joins the dots, really, and indeed identifies, captures, indeed evaluates, shares, and effectively uses information capital. So we're saying that a firm has several different forms of knowledge, tacit, organization-wide, etc. So knowledge management is, broadly speaking, well, how does it use it? How does it use that knowledge to make decisions? Some other key points in relation to knowledge management. In effect, what knowledge should do, or knowledge management should do, is certainly identify the key sources, the key areas of knowledge and critical functions and possible or potential bottlenecks within a business. In addition to that, it's in effect a set of processes or a collection of processes that sort of govern the creation, dissemination, and use of knowledge. As I said earlier on, really the management of the knowledge that an information has in whatever form that is. In addition to that, it may tie in or complement other systems, for example, total quality management, or indeed business process re-engineering. Okay. Next area for us is really, tech. So given what we've said, we're talking about systems that enable us to sort of leverage on the knowledge that we have. What sort of systems are used? What sort of tech is used within this particular area? Well, pretty standard, a portal, somewhere to hold knowledge, usually in most businesses through some sort of intranet, which provides access to staff. Perhaps, and these are just examples, perhaps an ERP of some kind, where data from many, many different sources will be collected as it says here, a single source of truth for the business, a sort of a knowledge house, as it were. And then linked into that, again, just possibilities, a DSS, some sort of, interactive program that is able to drill down into the organization-wide database to help decision makers make decisions. Okay, so that sort of deals with the sort of the tech side. What about learning or organizational learning? How is that relevant to this area of internal capabilities, resources, competences, etc.? Well, certainly a business should keep learning. A learning organization is one that actively creates, captures, transfers it, and mobilizes knowledge to enable it to adapt to a changing environment. We know certainly over the last 10 or 20 years, the business environment is changing rapidly. Businesses can't stand still. They need to learn. What are the other key points in this area? Well, certainly, one aspect of organizational learning is certainly the interaction between individuals. For example, between directors and managers, between managers and lower level staff. Higher end individuals will have knowledge. They will share this knowledge. So that interaction between staff is a form of learning for lower levels of staff. As it says here, very much organizational learning is about social process, about people, is about people sharing. Okay, and indeed, that culture is important, and indeed the tone from the top. The idea that you encourage learning, you encourage the transmission of information between different levels of the organization, and indeed horizontally as well as vertically. The right sort of vibe, the right environment. Let's look at strategic position. Now, we started off this particular area, this mind map, by saying that, okay, well, there's two sides to every analysis, or there should be, at least. External, yes, very important, tools and techniques such as PEST, Porter's Five Forces, etc., but also internal. And really what this chapter has focused on is the importance of a business understanding its capabilities, whatever they are, whether or not they are resources, assets, human, tangible, intangible, etc., or indeed competences. And this word of sort of threshold kept appearing, as did sort of unique stroke core. So let's remember that distinction. Now, in terms of the overall strategic position, clearly, if we were to look at a business and we were to really take into play the techniques and tools that have been discussed so far in this course, we'd certainly recognize that both sides are important. Both sides to the analysis are important. Our internal capabilities and indeed the external environment and our assessment through the use of tools of the external environment. Realistically, in today's modern society, I think we can't exclude one area. Next area for us, and indeed, I guess, final area, is one way of coming up with information relating to resources and indeed competences is a SWOT analysis. Now, we've seen SWOT elsewhere in the course, pretty straightforward. As I've mentioned, I like to look at the S and the W, the strengths and weaknesses, along the lines of what is good and bad now for us. What are the strengths and weaknesses? And that, to some extent, is geared towards the internal side. And in terms of the next two areas, I like to think of opportunities and threats as maybe what could be good and bad in the future. I mean, what other theorists would suggest would be that opportunities and threats are, broadly speaking, external to the business. So this model, I guess, ties in nicely with the theme in this particular mind map, this particular video, is that perhaps SWOT is a very, very good tool to look at those both sides to a strategic analysis. Okay. So, in terms of our closure point, what would be the most important areas here within this chapter 11? For me, it would probably be definitions. It would be the definitions of those various areas, whether or not they're resources or indeed competences. Let's get a feel for them. I also think that JSW's VRIN model and the terminology there is important to us. Okay, I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for listening, and indeed, good luck with your studies.